Cool, the stream has started. How do I get the link? Copy the link, okay, and then paste it in there. Cool, it works. Great. Gonna share this link with my team. Okay. I'm doing a live stream of a deep dive into HSDS React, specifically the prop provider system. No worries, YouTube saves live stream sessions as videos after it's done, which is why I do it in the first place. Cool. Alrighty. How do I see, is there a way for me to see chats? There has to be a way. Yeah, this is a way for me to see chat. Okay, great. I'm gonna start now. So today I'm going to be doing a deep dive into PropProvider. PropProvider is a system that we have within HSDS React, which is our component library, that basically it generates all the components that are rendered in React, but you're able to influence how those components behave from a systematic level. That didn't explain anything at all. Um, So what you can do, so I'm going to open a new thing here, is let's pretend I have a button, my button component, lovely button component. Great. So I'm rendering my button component in my app somewhere. I'm going to make this bigger. Okay, and get rid of that subpart. Cool. So if I want to change the behavior of my button to be like, I don't know, the kind of no, not the kind. Um, sure, the version. So by default, the button is version 1. So I'm just going to expose that. So I have a bunch of version 1 buttons throughout my application. Um, but eh, if I need to say, I need to update all of my buttons to use version 2, what you can do with the prop provider system is set up this very specific component somewhere in the higher portion of your application tree. Make sure all your buttons and whatever components you need render inside. And if you pass in a very specific prop called value, and the value is, it targets all the buttons and it'll change the button version from 1 to 2. So if you do that, you're able to change the behavior of all your components from that kind of high level systematic propagation, um, which is really, really useful. If you want to, say, isolate certain parts of your application where we currently have this going on at the moment, where if you have certain parts where you need to render the old buttons, but for a new section you need to render the new buttons, you're able to have this kind of fine-grained control. So you can do something like prop provider like that. And let's pretend this one is button version 1. And here you can do button version 2. So now in two separate parts of the application, without touching the components themselves, we're able to manipulate the version number of the button. You can pass in any kind of property. So you can even pass in like data attributes, like data, I don't know, on click does a thing. I don't know. You can pass in anything you want. That's just how it works is it'll look for the very specific namespace that you declared, in this case button. It'll match it against the component that you're rendering, and it'll spread or extend the properties that you've provided into that component when it renders. Um, the other really, uh, besides like globally and proportionally determining the behavior of your components, you can also compose um, components together. which is really, really nice. So a really good example of that is, let me see if I can pull this up. Bear with me a second. I'm going to open up the HSDS react.netlify.com. I think this is a URL. I'm using a different Chrome thing, so my history is not saved. That's okay. We need to take a look at accordion. Great. Here. Yep. So this, well, not this exactly. I have a new PR that does this kind of thing. But so we have accordions that look like this. So by default, they have a border and all that kind of stuff. But when an accordion renders within a page, it knows how to manipulate its behavior slightly differently. And this goes beyond just like CSS rules, which does work for certain things, but it doesn't work for interactions and behaviors, things that are JavaScript based. So how it's actually constructed is, let's say this little box that you're seeing, that's the page component. So within the page component, oh, I can just jump to the code. So within the page component itself, let me shrink this down a little bit. We have a prop provider in there. And this prop provider is saying, hey, anytime you see an accordion, or what is component key? Give me a second. Component key comes from, yeah. Anytime you see an accordion or any one of your subcomponents, please adjust their properties. So now anytime an accordion renders within a page, it knows how to change its behavior automatically without you having to manipulate the accordion in any kind of way. So yeah, that's the concept of prop provider. It's been very, very useful in trying to feature flag and migrate components from one version to another, or manipulating the behavior of components in certain parts of the application or certain interactions, and also composing components like parent to child components where properties need to be passed with varying levels of depth in between. So if you had, say, a component called top and another component called, I don't know, child, it's pretty simple to pass properties from here to here. Typically what you would do is within the render method of top, you would have something like content equals React children. I always forget this API. This, something like this. This props children. And then you do something with it. Typically it's a map. You map over them. Child. And then for every child, you return like an enhanced version of it. So it'd be like React clone element. You clone the element of the child and then you enhance it with specific properties. So if I do hello, and I can pluck const hello from this property, sorry, this component, and you can pass it through like that. So if you pass, say, hello equals we, by having this particular mechanism inside of the render method of top, I'm going to change this guy. JavaScript, React, yeah, you bet. So if I do render, or sorry, return children, by having this mechanism here, child will automatically get we as the property of hello because you're doing the clone map re-render thing. However, if you need to adjust child in particular, and there are varying numbers of divs or whatever in between top and child, in the past, what you would do is if you were to do it a very manual way, you would have to do this kind of cloning mechanism for every single thing in between top and child, which is bad. So this bad pattern is something that we describe as prop waterfalling, and that's something that you shouldn't ever really be doing. The better way of doing it is to leverage context, and that is the thing that allows you to pass properties and behaviors and stuff like that from a top level thing to a child thing with varying levels of depth. With the React 16, you can do something like React create context, and this creates a context object. Sorry, a context component, which gives you context provider and context consumer. So a context provider component accepts, I think, value or values, I'm not sure. Values, sure, as its only property. And what this does is that this sets whatever props and behaviors you want to the provider. And let's say I have a component called hello from hello. So if I want to pass in whatever values from this provider to hello, what you would do is do something like enhanced hello is a component that, oh man, my syntax is all messed up because I'm doing all this thing really terribly. It's fine. Um, you would do something like this. You would use the context consumer, which renders a render prop, which is a lovely pattern that you can do in React. Okay, and this one gives you, let's call it context props. This one gives you this value. So I'm just going to do const a equals, no, context props. This really should be an object. All right, give me a second. Okay, so if I pass in a into here, when you set up the consumer, it receives a from the provider, regardless of depth. And from this point, you would then render hello and pass in whatever properties you get from the consumer. And by doing this, you are now able, what the heck's going on there? You are now able to render hello and connect it to the context. And that is the pattern React folks recommend moving forward. However, this API was established in React 16. For our current systems, most of it is using React 15. So one thing you can do for React 15 based systems is use a polyfill for the CreateContext API. So what we have is I have created a library dedicated to React utilities. hub.com/help scout React utils. This is it. So this is a library I created that's dedicated to all the lower level things we need to do React things. One of them is to provide us with a polyfill for the CreateContext API. All it does is it brings in React Context, which is another polyfill. But this one acts as the adapter between this and our implementations, which gives us a little bit of finer grained control, which I like. And what that does is it essentially, if your React version supports it, it'll do the React create context thing. Otherwise, it'll do its own polyfill and it'll give you essentially the same object, which is the context provider and the context consumer. The other thing you can do is React legacy context. You can also leverage this legacy context, which before what you had to do was you had to declare in your provider this method called getChildContext, and you would then return a specific object. And in your consuming component, your child consuming component, you would have to establish context types, which then React knows under the hood. They know how to connect the top level thing to the child consuming thing. And this mechanism is actually how the polyfill works. So if your React version supports it, it'll use create context. Otherwise, it'll do this kind of legacy context mechanism to support React 15 and under. So that brings us to PropProvider. PropProvider leverages all the things I just talked about with the context, the create context, and then connecting that particular context to your child consuming component. But there are things in here that kind of go beyond just out of the box React Create Context. One thing that this does really well is you're able to extend properties. So, and you're able to nest prop providers throughout your application and also throughout components. So if I have a prop provider up here with a value of something, great. Const initial value is, I'm gonna use button again. Buttons are fun. Button is value, sorry, version 2, initial version, and I have some stuff in between. Is it values or value? I don't know. That's fine. Eh, content. And I have some stuff in between. And then eventually I get to a button. Great. So now this button will render with version 2. However, if I happen to also have another prop provider, like so, and this other prop provider happens to have some other values. Let's see, what's a kind primary? Then at this point, when the button renders, it'll have both of these guys combined together, which is nice. Because then you can kind of like enhance your components as you need to, and things will compound. Um, so the final values that this button will get is kind is primary, version is 2. And how, which is a very, very nifty feature. When I initially built PropProvider, it wasn't this. When I initially built it, it was just like only take the values from your most parent prop provider, and that serves as a cutoff point. Um, and we ran into some problems because I think the expected behavior is for you to extend it. So this was added, this ability to extend was added shortly afterwards. There's also other things that happens within the prop provider thing. Um, let's see. Oh yeah, so let's take a look at a component that's actually hooked up. What is a good one? What is a newer one? So the downside of this prop provider thing is that it was created mm, several months ago, many months ago, but not from the very beginning. So we have to backfill our component libraries to when we refactor to hook it up into the prop provider. So I'm going to take a look at, let's say, drop down header. That's a good one. Yeah, we actually don't need to do this anymore. That's okay. So what happens is you create your React component as normal, like so, and you import this very special Propconnect higher order function. And this higher order function, it takes in a namespace. So in this particular case, the component key header resolves to something like drop down header or something like that. It resolves to a string. And then the component that you want to hook up the connection with. And how that works is underneath the hood, there is an internal object or internal context state that the prop provider is aware of. And whenever you go to create the value like this is a namespace that the prop provider will match against however it is you set it up here. So if I happen to name it button, then if you did this, the kind and the version would have been passed into this drop-down header thing. So yeah, so that is how the initial hookup works. And those of you who have used like Redux are probably very familiar with this pattern. Redux does essentially the exact same thing. A lot of this code was actually borrowed from React Redux, where you have your initial provider with the initial state or the store. And then whenever you want to connect to the store, you're able to use this connect API that Redux provides you with, which is this. Dang it, autocomplete. So you would usually you would do something like this: export default, right? You would use Redux's connect, which will bind the store and your component together, and then you're able to do something like map state to props and manipulate the data and transform it before it gets served to your component. Exact same mechanism. So if we take now we know kind of know how it works. Let's take a look at the code. get ready to this is a little bit low level and gnarly. Where is it? Here's our prop provider. Um, like I mentioned earlier, in order for this thing to be able to extend itself, there is a recursive thing that happens where the prop provider starts off by being a consumer that grabs the context props from a hypothetical parent prop provider. And once you do that, it'll then merge the context props with whatever value you provide it. And then it smashes it together, and then now you have this merged properties that you can then use as normal. Yeah, that's. I mean, prop provider is very simple. It's just the only complex thing is it's a recursive thing that happens to be able to extend itself. The magic happens in prop connect. There's a bunch of things that are happening here, and this is really important if you're going to be building higher level components or sorry, higher order components, especially at the library level. One thing you have to be aware of is something is this hoist non-static non-React statics. And this is coming from, again, the React Utils library, which is grabbing it from another library. And what this does is, if you have, let's say I have my, what component should I call it? Hat, okay? I have a hat component that renders a div, and that's all it does, because hats are cool. So sometimes, depending on the kind of conventions and patterns you follow, uh, no, this is a bad name. Jacket. Jacket's a better name. So you can have subcomponents attached to this one, which are then essentially JavaScript statics. So you can have a component called sleeve, which also renders a div, and then you can have jacket.sleeve equals sleeve. So now sleeve is a subcomponent of jacket, which you can then render by doing this, jacket sleeve. So normally, if you were to pass this into a higher order function, a higher order component, like some HOC that accepts I think they typically call it a wrap component, and then you do stuff, and then you return the enhanced wrap component with enhanced things, and then you do something like enhanced jacket is some HOC with a jacket. So when you do this, if you were to try to use this is now undefined because this higher order component basically swallowed this guy up. So what you need to do is you need to hoist statics, which is what this is, from the wrap component and combine it with the final output that you're spitting out. So all that complicated mess is abstracted to this hoist non-React statics library, which I have applied to every single higher order component within the component library, and that is the thing that outputs here. So if you were to check out any library that follows this pattern, be it Redux or anything else, you'll notice something like this hoist non-React statics thing, and that's how they spit things out. Kind of nice to know how things work under the hood. Right. Um, Everything else, with the exception of some of this, is kind of straightforward. Great. Let us create the PropConnect component now. So the first attribute, first argument that you saw was essentially the namespace of the thing you want to connect. So in the previous example here, this was drop down header. Does this show? Ah, fun. No, this shows me the types. I want to see the values. That's fine. Which would be drop down header, and then right here, when it returns a function, this is where you pass in your component. PropConnect actually supports another argument rather. It's options. Um, in this particular version of HSDS, what you're seeing, all that's available is pure. Pure, this is another mechanism I borrowed from React Redux that allows you to adjust whether the final component that's rendered is a pure component, pure class component, or a component. And that's very important because there is a big difference between like a React component versus a React pure component. By default, the patterns that we follow from PropProvider down to the CSS and JavaScript rendering library and all that kind of stuff, we do pure by default. The reason for that is pure components over time render way faster compared to regular React components. The reason for that is I can get into that in another deep dive probably, but we want to do pure by default. However, we should expose the mechanism that allows a user to override that option if they need to. And we had to do this for, where is it? Nav link. Yes. So for this particular component, navlink, we had to disable the pure property and make sure that it renders a regular React component. And the reason for that is React router pure, you'll see. It's because that particular component enhances navlink from React router. And React router has a problem where if you render something using a pure component like this, it blocks the render cycle from happening for reasons that I think are a little bit silly, but the workaround is to use a non-pure component or a stateless functional component. So by exposing that mechanism, we're able to bypass this issue and just simply pass pure as false, and then it'll work as normal. That's good. So now we do some fancy things. So this thing, namespacing. So this is really important and typically something that you only really think about from the library level. And that is properly giving your component or the thing that your higher order component spits out a proper namespace. So by default, the how React evaluates the name of your component is based on the name of the function. So if we have, I think it's this one. I may be wrong, but anyway. So by default, Propconnect spits out a function named this. So when you go to check out your React application inside of the React DevTools inside of Chrome, or when you go to inspect the DOM tree, that enzyme renders or something inside of your test environment, you'll probably see a component named this, which, I mean, if you have a lot of them, it's not very helpful because everything will have the same name and now you don't know what you're looking at, and that's bad. So with higher order components, especially the ones in libraries, like I'll throw this, Redux does this, is you try to name these things as best as possible. So I have a get, where is it? Get name component. Ah, get component. Right. This is also coming from React Utils. Like I mentioned, a lot of things come from React Utils because I read it once, I don't want to write it again. So what that basically does is it does like a switch condition thing where it's like, all right, does your component have a component display name? Great, use that. Display name is a very specific static property that React uses to indicate the display name of a component. That is the highest priority. So does it have this? Yes, use that. If not, all right. Does your component have a name, which is the name of the function, which might not be available if you pass in anonymous functions or anonymous functions. Usually this happens with stateless functional components. So React name, do you have, or sorry, component name, do you have one? If yes, use that. Otherwise, it'll fall back to just component, which is, I think, a little bit more helpful than, I don't know what it would use normally. So that is the conditions of which it'll try to get the name. So after I have my name, I will then set the display name of my component to be Propconnected namespace. So this is a convention that you see a lot in React, where the higher order component will have something that looks like, Jesus. Man, auto connect sometimes, or sorry, autofill sometimes. This is why I use Vim sometimes. Anyway, so if you pass in a component named jacket, the namespace that you would see inside of your React DevTools or testing environment will look like this, which is much more helpful than, I don't know, what was it? Propconnect or something. I don't know. This is way easier to spot than this. So that is what that mechanism does. Okay. So now at this part, we're trying to figure out whether you want to render a pure component or component. By default, like I mentioned, it renders a pure component. And this connect component, we're creating this now. It's extending from either pure or component. By default, we're doing pure. This is kind of straightforward stuff. We're setting the display name. And one thing that we decided to do, and this is something I paired with a coworker, his name is Nicholas, great guy, pair with him on, is exposing the wrapped component as part of the Propconnected instance. That allows you to access the original component, which is useful for tests for reasons. So that sets it here, like so. And this is getting namespace stuff. This merge, this merge stuff is really interesting. So this component, when it finally outputs whatever it needs, we're consuming data from from this context consumer thing, and then we need to pass it to the wrapped component that we're wrapping with a higher order, which is right around here. Right, header. So when you go to use drop-down header, like that, and you're giving it some props. I don't know, some props. Right. So what it needs is it needs to get the value of some props plus the context props together, and then it feeds it into the original drop-down header. Sorry, the original header. So in order for me to do that, what I decided to do was, let me jump here. I have this very special method that takes in the context props and just handles the mashing of it all together. So what I do, I get everything from this props. This props is now whatever properties you pass into the component when you instantiate it. I pluck the namespace props from the context. I think this namespace props, what is that? What on earth is that? Oh, right. This gets into another thing. I'll talk about it later. I know what this is. Okay. Class name. So this is really important. This is extending class names is a thing that I built into the library since day one. This is a pattern that I've noticed some other libraries fail in that if you go to use a component like jacket and you give it a class name of brown, because I want a brown jacket, depending on how the component is set up, oftentimes, if the library didn't consider this, your brown class name won't actually get rendered out. It's because in the jacket component, class name, you need to do something that looks like this. If I render out a div and a class name, and then I do a class name, you need to pass that specific property into the final DOM element that you're trying to render. And if you do some fancy things like giving it additional class names, you need some sort of function or mechanism that extends the one that the user is giving you and also the ones that you're enhancing. So the go-to library that people use is ClassNames by Jed Watson, very, very smart guy. I believe he works at Atlassian. It's a very tiny library. It's very flexible. And then you're able to do something like import CX from ClassNames. CX is a convention, I think, because it's a little bit shorter. So if I have a render method, const class name equals this props, I can then const component class name equals CX and do a thing. So I can do like A, pass in a bunch of class names that I need to do, A, B, C, D, and eventually I'll give this one, right? And pretend this is my jacket component, class jacket extends React component, right? This is my jacket component. So now when I go to use jacket, class name, by doing this, hello. The compiled class name will look like will look like this. A, B, C, D, hello. So this allows you to extend the class names. Um, and this is very, very important because for our systems, the way to style components isn't necessarily purely JavaScript driven. Our systems use a combination of CSS and JavaScript for the most part, for the newer stuff, which is great. But the very important thing is that it needs to integrate into older systems, which use a combination of inline styles, style tags, Sass that evaluate the CSS, and so on. So all of that needs to play really nicely together. And in order to do that, we need to be able to use class names as if you were using an or if you were creating a default HTML component. So that needs to be reliable, and class names need to extend. The other thing that we need to do for this is for our particular CSS and JavaScript solution, which is fancy fun name, help scale fancy here. This is basically Emotion under the hood. It was a forked version of Emotion, version 9 something that I did a while back, but it's been super enhanced for our particular needs. So how Fancy works is when it creates a CSS class name based on your styled component rules, it can be anything you want. It does CSS and then some garbled thing. Um, so when you go to extend components, like I'm going to compose a brand new component, styled component from another one, or if I have nested styled components, you need the CSS compiler needs to like be able to combine class names together like that, and so on. Hello and whatever it is you need. It needs to be able to have that mechanism built into it, which is why for at least for PropConnect, when you're using a higher order, I need to be able to extend these class names. So that is a very, very important mechanism within PropConnect that most people don't really think about, which is great. You shouldn't ever have to think about this stuff when you go to use these components, but it's very, very important. Same with styled. Styled is another thing that you should be able to extend as if you're using a default HTML component. So that mechanism is built in here as well. It's a lot simpler compared to class name just because styled is an object that you can spread. So you just spread this object and it'll be fine. Um, and the rest is, yeah, I'm just combining all the objects together until I get a single flat object to be able to pass into my wrapped component there. A relatively new feature that we're adding into PropConnect is data sci or data cy, which is a convention we're going to be using for Cypress tests. And what's really nice about this is because in theory, all the components are built using this PropConnect mechanism. By adding this single line of code, anything that's built with or connected with PropConnect automatically becomes Cypress friendly. They just get the data sci thing built into them as a default, and they get the namespace outputted. So if I construct the base, if I build a base level button, when it evaluates into HTML, you'll get an HTML button, but also data sci button, just because that's the namespace of the component. So when folks need to write end-to-end tests with Cypress, you can do a match for data sci and button. It'll be very simple. Um, and the order of this matters here because it's nice to have a data sci by default, but then also maybe you need to have data sci special button for a very specific use case. Um, so if I put my own data sci here, it'll then evaluate to data special button like that. But if I change the order of this, what the heck? Oh, wrong button. If I change the order of that to that, just by moving it 2 lines down, the order of how it spreads, this will no longer work. It'll actually evaluate to this because your data sci thing is here, and then I'm going to override your data sci with whatever is namespace is. In this case, it's button. And that's unexpected behavior, and now all your end-to-end tests break, and that's bad. So yeah, the order of these things matter as you go to extend these things. And then we pass in class name, we pass in style because we've already done the merge stuff for you. So it's fine, completely fine to override the things that the user provides because that's already been accounted for. And the last thing we got to do is ref. Oh boy. So ref is a very fun one. Um, in React, you're able to reference the node of a particular component by using the special ref prop. So if I do div ref, um, usually it's like this, and then you would do something with the node, like let hello is nothing, and then you would assign the node to hello. Node. So now when this evaluates, hello is actually a HTML element, which is a div. Um, and the interesting thing about this is that you're only able to do this for class-based components. You cannot use ref, with the exception of the default HTML ones. You cannot use ref with a stateless functional. So if I had a const jacket is a thing that renders a div, so it outputs a div. And if I tried to reference the div from the jacket like this, let me just spread through the props. Spread all the props and give it to the div. This actually won't work because stately functionals do not give you references to anything. You can only do it for classes. I think so. This has been changed slightly with the newer React stuff. They have hooks that enable you to do reference things. I don't know. I haven't followed it too closely, just because we're still focused on React 15, 16. So this is the world I'm in. Perfectly fine. Um, so in order to make sure that ref doesn't break, I have a check to check if it's stateless. So if it's stateless, then pass in so if it's not stateless, rather, then pass in the desired reference. Otherwise, don't do anything, otherwise, because it will break. Um, the interesting thing about refs is it doesn't necessarily evaluate to the DOM node. It evaluates to the top level thing that your component renders. In this case, because it's a higher order, uh, I can't remember what it references to. It might actually be undefined. So what we're doing here is that we're giving the original wrapped component as the reference. So that's another way for you to access the original wrapped component. And that's it. Many, many steps in order for us to set up this prop provider prop connect mechanism. And the magic lies in prop provider's ability to be able to extend and recursively extend itself, and for any connected component to be able to access data and state and so on from the provider, its closest provider, and magically handle the merge of things like style, class name, and whatever, so that your component will work out of the box with no issues. And every single or the majority of new components constructed inside of HSDS React use this mechanism. And yeah, it's been working great so far. But this took a while to get here. And this was a solution I came up with in response to the awful component prop waterfalling pattern that we had before, which, I mean, there's still bits of it inside of HSDS React because we haven't cleaned it up. Um, but yeah, this has been proving tremendously useful for us. And this is a deep dive into how this works. Hopefully you found this helpful. Hope you have a great day. Catch you later. Bye.